When I stepped off the plane, the weight of my actions hit me like a freight train. The week-long work trip that was supposed to be about networking and productivity had turned into something I could barely process, a whirlwind of decisions I regretted with every fiber of my being. I tried to ignore the ache in my chest as I collected my luggage and made my way to the rideshare line. The bright airport lights felt too harsh, and every passing glance from strangers felt like judgment. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my husband, James. "What time do you land? Can't wait to see you. I'll have dinner ready." The warmth in his words only deepened the pit in my stomach. I didn't deserve his kindness, his unwavering support. Not after what I'd done. By the time the car pulled into our driveway, it was nearly dark. The house looked just as it had when I'd left, warm and inviting, the porch light glowing softly. But as I walked inside, something felt off. James was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Welcome home," he said, turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile of my own. "Everything looks amazing." "Figured I'd make your favorite," he said, gesturing to the table, where a bottle of wine and 2 glasses sat waiting. The tension in the room was subtle but undeniable, like a string pulled too tight. I couldn't shake the feeling that James knew, though I didn't understand how he possibly could. We sat down to eat, the conversation stilted. James asked about the trip, and I gave short, vague answers, hoping to steer the topic elsewhere. But he didn't push. Not yet. It wasn't until after dinner, when the kids were in bed and the house was quiet, that the facade began to crack. "I need to ask you something," James said, his tone careful but firm. My heart skipped a beat. "What is it? Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, searching for a way to deflect, to deny. But the look on his face told me that he already knew, or at least suspected. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice trembling. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I found your texts, Laura. The ones with your coworker." The blood drained from my face. "James, I can explain." "Can you?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty clear." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of my guilt was too heavy, and I could see the pain in his eyes, pain I had caused. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Was I not enough for you? Was our family not enough?" "It wasn't like that," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake, James, a horrible, stupid mistake." "Didn't mean anything," he repeated, his tone bitter. "You betrayed me, Laura. You betrayed our family. How could that mean nothing?" The conversation spiraled from there, anger and heartbreak spilling out in a torrent of words we couldn't take back. By the end of the night, James had packed a bag and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the silence of a house that no longer felt like home. The silence after James left was deafening. I sat on the couch, staring at the door as if willing him to walk back through it. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't, not tonight, and maybe not ever. I replayed the argument in my head, every word cutting deeper as the weight of what I'd done pressed down on me. The look in James's eyes, the mixture of pain and betrayal, was burned into my memory. I had never seen him like that before, and I hated myself for being the reason. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. The kids were staying at James's parents' place for the weekend, something we had planned long before the storm of last night. At the time, I had been relieved for the chance to decompress after my work trip. Now, the quiet felt unbearable. I checked my phone, hoping for a message from James. There was none. Instead, there was a single text from my coworker, Nick, the man I had betrayed my husband with. "Hey, just checking in. Hope you're okay." I stared at the message, disgusted with myself. I couldn't even bring myself to respond. Whatever had happened between Nick and me wasn't worth this, wasn't worth the destruction of my family. I spent the day trying to distract myself, cleaning the house, catching up on work emails, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But every time I stopped, the guilt came rushing back, a tidal wave that threatened to pull me under. By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't take the silence any longer. I called James, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear. It went to voicemail. "James, please call me," I said, my voice shaking. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I just need to talk to you. Please." The minutes stretched into hours, but the phone never rang. The following day, James finally called. His voice was cold, distant. "I'll be coming by to get some things," he said. "I'll let you know when so you can be out of the house." "James, wait," I said, desperation creeping into my tone. "Can we talk? Please?" "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice firm. "You made your choice, Laura. Now I'm making mine." His words cut deeper than anything he had said the night before. I wanted to fight, to plead with him to stay, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Not yet, anyway. Over the next week, I threw myself into therapy, desperate to understand why I had done what I did. My therapist didn't judge me, but she didn't let me off the hook either. "What do you think led to this?" she asked during our first session. "I don't know," I said, tears streaming down my face. I was stressed, overwhelmed. Nick was just there. He listened when I felt like no one else did. "And did it help?" she asked. "The affair, did it make you feel less stressed, less overwhelmed?" "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It just made everything worse." "Then let's start there," she said. "Let's figure out what you were running from and how to confront it head-on." The sessions were exhausting, but they gave me a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I began to see how my own insecurities and lack of communication had played a role in what happened, not as an excuse, but as a way to understand and prevent it from happening again. James, meanwhile, remained distant. He came by the house a few times to pick up clothes and other essentials, but our conversations were brief and strained. The kids, thankfully, seemed oblivious to the tension between us, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they started asking questions. One evening, after the kids were asleep, James called. "We need to figure out how to move forward," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I agree," I said, my heart pounding. "Can we meet and talk?" There was a long pause before he said, "Fine. Tomorrow night." The next evening, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the air thick with tension. "I'm not going to pretend that I'm ready to forgive you," James said, his voice steady but cold. "But for the sake of the kids, we need to figure out how to make this work." "I understand," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." James sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't something you can just fix, Laura. It's going to take time. A lot of time." "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'm willing to fight for us, James. For our family." He didn't respond, but the fact that he was sitting there, willing to talk, gave me a glimmer of hope. The weeks after our first real conversation were some of the hardest of my life. James and I had agreed to prioritize the kids above all else, but it quickly became clear how difficult that would be. The tension between us was palpable, even in the moments we tried to hide it. We established a tentative schedule. James would stay with his parents for the time being but come to the house in the evenings to spend time with the kids. For their sake, we tried to keep things as normal as possible, even though nothing about our situation felt normal. Every evening when James walked through the door, I felt a pang of guilt and longing. He was cordial but distant, his interactions with me limited to logistical discussions about the kids or the house. "Do you need me to pick up groceries this week?" I asked one evening as we stood in the kitchen. No, I've got it, he said, not meeting my eyes. His coldness stung, but I knew I had no right to expect anything else. My therapist encouraged me to focus on taking responsibility for my actions, rather than expecting immediate reconciliation. Healing takes time, she reminded me. And right now, your focus should be on understanding what led to this and how you can prevent it from happening again. So that's what I did. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto the page in a way that felt both cathartic and revealing. I began to see patterns in my behavior, moments when I had avoided difficult conversations with James, times when I had allowed my frustrations to fester rather than addressing them head-on. But understanding my mistakes didn't make them any easier to live with. Every time I looked at James, I saw the pain in his eyes, the trust one had shattered. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I found him sitting on the back porch. The glow of his phone lit up his face, but his expression was distant. Mind if I join you? I asked hesitantly. He shrugged, not looking up. It's a free country. I sat down, the cool night air prickling my skin. I know you don't want to hear this, but I'm sorry, I said softly. For everything. James let out a bitter laugh. You've said that already, Laura. I know, I said, my voice trembling. But I need you to know how much I regret what I did. It wasn't about you, James. It was about me, about my own insecurities and failures. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just hurt me, you hurt our family. Our kids. I know, I said, tears streaming down my face. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you, if you'll let me. James didn't respond, but the fact that he didn't immediately walk away felt like progress. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding trust in small ways. I made an effort to communicate openly, even when it was uncomfortable. I stopped avoiding the hard questions, instead meeting them head-on with honesty and humility. But for every step forward, there were setbacks. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table with the kids, James's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. Who's texting you? He asked, his tone sharp. It's just a work email, I said quickly, holding up the phone to show him. His suspicion cut deep, but I couldn't blame him. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, it had to be earned, piece by piece. As the weeks turned into months, there were moments of hope. James began to stay for family game nights, laughing along with the kids in a way that felt almost normal. We started having occasional conversations that weren't purely logistical, sharing small glimpses of the connection we had once taken for granted. But there were also moments of doubt, times when I wondered if we could ever truly move past what had happened. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, I found one of James's shirts, a faint trace of his cologne still lingering on the fabric. I pressed it to my face, the familiar scent bringing a flood of memories. I missed him. Not just as my husband, but as my best friend, the person who had been by my side through every high and low. I decided to write him a letter. James, I know that words can't undo the hurt I've caused, but I need you to know how much I love you and our family. I made a terrible mistake, one that I will regret for the rest of my life. But I'm committed to making things right, to proving that I'm worthy of your trust again. I hope that one day, we can find a way to rebuild what we've lost. Laura. I left the letter on his desk, unsure if he would read it or if it would make any difference. When he came over that evening, he didn't mention the letter, but there was a softness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The days following my letter were a mixture of cautious hope and lingering tension. James hadn't said anything about it, but something in his demeanor shifted. He was still guarded, his responses to me clipped and careful, but the outright hostility had softened. I knew better than to push him. Trust couldn't be rushed, and I didn't want to risk undoing the fragile progress we'd made. Instead, I focused on consistency, showing him, day by day, that I was committed to rebuilding what I had broken. Our interactions became more civil, and gradually, something resembling normalcy returned to our home. James still spent most nights at his parents' house, but he began staying later during his visits with the kids, sometimes lingering even after they'd gone to bed. One evening, as we sat in the living room while the kids played upstairs, James finally broke the silence. "I read your letter," he said, his voice measured. My heart raced. "And?" He hesitated, his brow furrowed. "I appreciate what you said. But words only mean so much, Laura. It's going to take more than that to fix this." "I know," I said quietly. "I'm not expecting things to go back to the way they were overnight. I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll see," he said simply. Despite his cautious response, I clung to the hope that his willingness to engage meant we were moving in the right direction. We started small, short conversations after the kids went to bed, shared moments during family dinners. At first, it felt like walking on eggshells, both of us careful not to say or do anything that might reignite old wounds. But as time went on, those moments became easier, more natural. One Saturday, James suggested we take the kids to the park together. It was the first time we'd done something as a family since everything had come to light, and the day was filled with a bittersweet mix of joy and nostalgia. Watching James laugh with the kids, I was reminded of why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. As we packed up to leave, James turned to me. "Thanks for suggesting this," he said. "You're the one who suggested it," I replied, confused. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Still, it was nice. For the kids, and for us." That simple acknowledgement felt like a victory. In therapy, I continued to unpack the choices that had led me to this point. My therapist helped me understand the underlying issues in my marriage and within myself that had contributed to my infidelity. "You can't change the past," she reminded me during one session. "But you can learn from it. And that's what will determine whether you can rebuild your marriage." James also started therapy on his own, something I hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. It was clear that he was grappling with his own pain and anger, and while he didn't share much about his sessions, I could see the impact they were having on him. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, James surprised me by opening up. "Therapy's been hard," he admitted, staring out at the yard. "I'm glad you're going," I said gently. "I know it's not easy. It's helping me understand some things," he continued. "Like how I've always avoided conflict instead of dealing with it. How I let things build up instead of addressing them head-on." I nodded, letting his words sink in. "I think we both did that," I said. "I should have been honest with you about how I was feeling instead of looking for answers somewhere else." The conversation was raw and uncomfortable, but it felt like progress. As the weeks turned into months, we began to rebuild our lives piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of tension, still times when the weight of the past threatened to pull us back. But there were also moments of hope, shared laughter, quiet evenings on the porch, and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie after the kids had gone to bed, James turned to me and said, "I'm not ready to forgive you completely. But I want to try." Tears filled my eyes, and I nodded. "That's all I can ask for," I said. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning, a fragile, tentative step toward a future we were both willing to fight for. The weeks following James's words, "I want to try," were a delicate dance between hope and fear. It wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about learning how to be in the same space without letting the past cast a shadow over every moment. James began staying at the house more often, not just for the kids but for us. He hadn't moved back in completely, but the small steps he was taking felt monumental. It was in the way he lingered after dinner, the way he began asking about my day again, the way he offered to help with bedtime routines. One evening, after the kids were asleep, we sat together in the living room. The quiet was comfortable for once, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. "You seem happier," he said, breaking the stillness. I looked at him, surprised. "Do I?" He nodded. "I've noticed. Therapy must be helping." "It is," I said, smiling faintly. "It's not easy, though. Facing everything, what I did, why I did it, it's a lot." He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I'm realizing that I wasn't perfect, either. I didn't see it before, but maybe I could have done more." "James, this wasn't your fault," I said quickly. "You didn't do anything to deserve what I did." "I'm not saying it was my fault," he said gently. "But I think I ignored things I shouldn't have. I assumed we were fine because we didn't fight much, but maybe that was part of the problem. We weren't really communicating." His honesty took me by surprise, but it also gave me a sense of relief. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page, not excusing what had happened, but acknowledging the cracks that had existed long before the affair. Our conversations became more open after that. We talked about the things we had avoided for years, the frustrations, the unmet needs, the moments when we had both felt alone in our marriage but hadn't known how to say it. "I didn't know how to tell you I was struggling," I admitted during one of our late-night talks. "I was scared you'd think I was blaming you, and I didn't want to hurt you." "I wish you had told me," he said quietly. "It would have hurt, sure. But not as much as this." His words stung, but they were fair. The kids, blissfully unaware of the complexities unfolding around them, were thrilled to have their dad around more often. Watching James with them, I saw glimpses of the man I had fallen in love with, the man who read bedtime stories with funny voices, who coached soccer games on weekends, who made pancakes on Saturday mornings with too much syrup and not enough skill. One Saturday, as we sat together at the breakfast table, my oldest looked up and said, "I like it when we're all together." His words brought a lump to my throat, and I saw James's expression soften. "Me too, buddy," he said, ruffling his hair. In therapy, I continued to explore the deeper issues within myself that had contributed to my choices. My therapist helped me understand the ways I had sought validation outside of my marriage, the ways I had allowed resentment to fester instead of addressing it. "It's not about blaming yourself," she said during one session. "It's about taking responsibility for your actions while also learning to meet your needs in healthier ways." James, too, was working on himself. He began opening up about his own struggles, his own fears of inadequacy as a husband and father. "I always felt like I had to be perfect," he admitted one night. "Like if I showed any weakness, I'd be failing you and the kids." "You don't have to be perfect," I said, my voice trembling. "I never needed that. I just needed you." Those conversations, raw and painful as they were, became the foundation for something new. We started going on small dates, nothing extravagant, just coffee or a walk in the park. At first, it felt awkward, like we were two strangers trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. But as time went on, those moments became easier, more natural. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, James turned to me and said, "Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But maybe that's not the goal. Maybe it's about building something new." He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "I like that idea." The road ahead wasn't clear, and there were still days when the weight of the past felt overwhelming. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope, not just for us, but for the future we were creating together. The journey to healing felt less like a straight path and more like a winding road with unexpected turns. Some days, it felt like James and I were on the same team again, laughing together at the kids' antics, sharing quiet conversations late into the night. Other days, the weight of what had happened lingered between us like an uninvited guest, a reminder of how fragile our progress was. One evening, as we sat in the living room, James surprised me with a question that caught me off guard. "What made you decide to come clean?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I couldn't keep lying," I said finally. "Every time I looked at you, I felt like I was breaking something. I knew I had to tell you, even if it meant losing everything." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad you did. As much as it hurt, I'd rather know the truth than live in a lie." It was moments like that, moments of raw honesty, that made me believe we could rebuild something stronger. James had begun moving a few things back into the house, a jacket in the hallway closet, a spare pair of shoes by the door. It wasn't a full return, but it was enough to give me hope. One Saturday, while the kids were at a birthday party, James suggested we spend the afternoon together. "Just the two of us," he said, his tone light but serious. I agreed, and we ended up walking through a nearby nature trail. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. For a while, we walked in silence, the only sounds coming from the rustling trees and the distant chirping of birds. "This is nice," James said after a while. "It feels normal." "Yeah," I agreed, smiling faintly. "It does." As we walked, we talked about the little things, work, the kids, the weather. But eventually, the conversation turned to us. "Do you ever think about the future?" James asked, his voice cautious. "All the time," I admitted. "I think about what it would take to get back to a place where we feel secure again. Where we trust each other completely." "That's going to take a long time," he said, his tone thoughtful. "But I'm willing to work on it if you are." His words were a balm to my wounded heart. "I am," I said, my voice steady. We spent the rest of the walk discussing what rebuilding trust might look like: more open communication, shared decision-making, and a renewed commitment to prioritizing each other. It felt like laying the first bricks of a new foundation, one built with intention and care. At home, I began noticing subtle changes in James. He was more present, more engaged with the kids, and more willing to open up about his own feelings. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, he shared something that took me by surprise. "I used to think being strong meant not showing weakness," he said, staring out at the darkened yard. "But I'm realizing now that strength is about being vulnerable. About being honest, even when it's hard." His words resonated deeply with me. "I think we're both learning that," I said quietly. As we continued to navigate our new normal, I made a conscious effort to show James that I valued him, not just as a husband, but as a partner and a person. I planned small surprises, like leaving notes in his lunch bag or organizing a family game night. They were small gestures, but they felt significant. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, James approached me with a hesitant smile. "I found something today," he said, holding out a folded piece of paper. I opened it and recognized it immediately. It was a note I had written to him years ago, back when we were first married. It was filled with promises of love and commitment, written in the giddy optimism of newlyweds. "I found it in an old box in the garage," he said. Reading it made me realize how much we've been through. How much we've overcome. Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at him. "I meant every word of that when I wrote it," I said. "And I still mean it now." James nodded, his eyes glistening. "Me too." That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. We weren't there yet, not fully, but we were moving in the right direction. The quiet transformation in our home was almost imperceptible at first, a lighter tone in our conversations, a shared laugh during a family movie night, the absence of tension that had once hung heavy between us. It wasn't that everything was perfect, it was that we had started to find comfort in the imperfection, in the effort we were both making to rebuild. James had moved back into the house. At first it was small things, a night here, a weekend there, but eventually, he brought his bags through the door and placed them in the closet beside mine. There was no grand announcement, no ceremony marking the occasion, but the sight of his things next to mine felt like a victory. One evening, as we sat together in the kitchen while the kids worked on their homework, James surprised me with a question. "What do you think made us drift apart in the first place?" The question was direct, and it caught me off guard. I set down the dish I'd been washing and turned to face him. "I think it was a lot of little things," I said carefully. "We got caught up in life, work, the kids, routines, and we stopped making time for each other. I stopped telling you how I felt, and eventually, I stopped feeling like I could." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think I stopped paying attention. I assumed we were fine because we weren't fighting, but I wasn't really present." "We both let it happen," I said softly. "But we can't let it happen again." He reached across the table and took my hand. "We won't," he said firmly. Our vow to prioritize each other wasn't just words, it became a guiding principle in our daily lives. We started carving out time for ourselves, even if it was just an hour after the kids went to bed to sit and talk. We rediscovered the little things that had brought us together in the first place, the shared jokes, the quiet moments of connection, the willingness to be vulnerable. One weekend, James suggested we take the kids on a camping trip. It wasn't something we'd done before, but the idea of spending a few days unplugged from the world appealed to both of us. The trip was filled with its fair share of challenges, forgotten gear, rainy weather, and the inevitable sibling squabbles, but it was also filled with moments of joy. Sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories, I felt a sense of togetherness that had been missing for so long. One night, after the kids had fallen asleep in the tent, James and I sat by the fire, wrapped in a shared blanket. "This feels good," he said, his voice quiet but content. "It does," I agreed, resting my head on his shoulder. "I'm glad we're doing this," he said. "Not just the trip, but everything, working through it all. I wasn't sure if we'd ever get here." "Me neither," I admitted. "But I'm glad we didn't give up." As the fire crackled and the stars shone above us, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about forgiving each other, it was about forgiving ourselves, about learning to let go of the past and embrace the possibility of a brighter future. Back at home, life settled into a new rhythm. We weren't the same couple we had been before the affair, but we had found a new version of ourselves, one built on honesty, resilience, and a deeper appreciation for the love we shared. One evening, as we prepared dinner together, James turned to me and said, "Do you think we should renew our vows?" The question took me by surprise, but as I looked at him, I knew my answer immediately. "I'd like that," I said, smiling. The ceremony was small and intimate, held in our backyard with just a handful of close friends and family. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about celebrating the progress we had made and the future we were building together. As we stood under a canopy of string lights, surrounded by the people who mattered most, James took my hands in his and said, "I promise to keep choosing you every day, even when it's hard. I promise to listen, to be present, and to never take what we have for granted again." Tears filled my eyes as I recited my own vows, a reflection of the love and commitment that had carried us through our darkest moments. "I promise to be honest, to communicate, and to cherish the family we've built," I said. "I promise to keep growing, both with you and for you." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and as James and I kissed, I felt a sense of closure and renewal all at once. Our life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was ours, flawed, messy, and beautiful in its resilience. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at home.